It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS AM 1160 and 101.1 FM, Indiana in the Morning, presented by First Commonwealth Bank. And Katherine March is on the telephone with us. Katherine is the author of the new book, Nowhere Boy, which is a work of fiction, but Katherine, not really, huh? This is something that comes very close to your heart and from personal experience.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This book really did come out of a personal experience. In 2015, my family moved to Brussels, Belgium. My husband is a journalist, and we ended up spending 3 years there with our children. And the year we arrived was the height of the refugee crisis, and there were also a number of terror attacks that happened across Europe, including in Brussels itself. So those events really inspired this book.
How was it that you decided to move to Brussels, Belgium? That's not something that people off the top of their head say, hey, honey, tomorrow I've got this, this, and this on my schedule, and we're moving to Brussels.
Exactly, indeed. So my husband is a newspaper reporter, and he had the opportunity to go to Brussels to cover NATO and European security. So that is how we ended up there. That
as a background, how much did that inform what it is that you ended up with when you wrote Nowhere Boy?
Well, it somewhat informed it because my husband's background is in covering the military and security. He covered the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. When we got there, he was covering both, NATO security and also terrorism. And so those topics were on our mind, certainly on my mind, and then to experience them personally, really brought to the fore these issues that I wanted to write about for young people, about how to process difficult events going on around them.
So this story develops in Brussels and really develops around the house that you actually moved into?
Exactly. It's an incredible story because basically Nowhere Boy is the story of an American boy, Max, who's a underachiever in a family of achievers, whose family, like ours, moves to Brussels for a year, and he's very unhappy there. And he develops a friendship with a Syrian refugee orphan who's there as an unaccompanied minor named Ahmed, who doesn't want to be in Belgium either. And these two boys, develop a friendship and go on an adventure there, and it's all set during these events of the refugee crisis and the terror attacks and the Brussels lockdown.
One of the things that your book does for us is it opens up our eyes and I hope our hearts to the real suffering that refugees in any situation, but in this particular situation, the Syrian refugees are experiencing. How versed were you in that when you began this process?
Well, I wasn't very, and when we moved there, we were going through our own kind of process of feeling like outsiders, and we put our children in the local French-speaking school. They didn't speak French, and we were sort of immersed in that. But at the same time, we became aware of this, the fact that 1 million people were arriving in Europe that year. And in Brussels, you saw that manifest in even, places like one of the local parks, which became a Red Cross camp. And a lot of our neighbors and friends became involved in taking care of refugees and helping them. And you realized how difficult their situation was of arriving in a new country, going through, trying to learn a new language, a new culture, and having absolutely nothing. So that was really something that was happening all around us. And at the same time, you mentioned my house before, and I had learned that our block was renamed after World War II for a man who had hidden a Jewish teenage refugee in his house. So the living history really offered an amazing parallel with what was going on around us.
And one of the things that we begin to understand as well is, in the character of Max and in your personal experience, here you are, your family moves into an unfamiliar culture, an unfamiliar land. You have to get yourselves into that mindset of living there. And here's a group of Syrian refugees, and that whole melting pot idea that we have here in America is something that might not be as evident in other cultures, or is it? Are they able to assimilate into those other cultures as quickly as Americans might, or even faster?
That's a great question. And, this issue is so close to my heart because I have 3 grandparents who are immigrants. And my grandmother, who I actually grew up with, came to this country in 1928. She was from Eastern Europe, but she came through Mexico because of a 1924 law that tried to limit the number of immigrants coming from Eastern Europe who are considered undesirable. So this was a story that was really close to my heart, and I think Europe is struggling, with how to integrate people, and there are real kind of difficult logistic questions about how to integrate people. But at the same time, there is this moral imperative to help people who have come from, countries that are at war, that have, terrible economic collapse. And I certainly feel like it's part of the American experience, to give those people opportunity. And it certainly happened with my own family.
We're talking with Katherine March. The book is called Nowhere Boy, and you can visit katherinemarsh.com to learn more about it. It's Katherine, Marsh, MARSH.com. You can also visit her on Twitter at Marsh Katherine. I'm interested in, you have a background as a writer for young folks. How did you decide where you were going to target this book? Who was going to be the person that you wanted to read this book? How did that develop with your mind?
That's a great question because it deals with some difficult topics. And I to be honest, I wrote it in part for my own children as a way to give them to process what was going on around them. And there was a lot of fear that year in Europe because of the terror attacks. And I really wanted them to be able to separate that fear, to legitimize it, to understand that people were feeling afraid, but at the same time to not let that overwhelm their sense of empathy and tolerance for other people, and to be able to separate some of those fears from some of the facts on the ground about who the refugees were and why they were coming. So that was one thing I wanted to do. And the other thing, it's interesting because I started the book in 2015 when, our own country was in a very different place politically, and I found the story became more and more relevant because it's really about this question of what to do, when you're feeling powerless and frightened, and positive ways to deal with that, and so you don't feel so helpless, and also about this issue of what our duty is to others. And that was a really important theme of the book. So
you start this book 3 years ago. How old were your boys then?
I have a boy and a girl, and they were, at the time, they were 7 and 4 when we arrived in Belgium, and they're now 10 and 7.
Wow.
But they, my son was 8 years old when the terror attack happened in Brussels, and I picked him up from school, him and his sister, and took them home in the middle of the day because I was so worried that something could happen even at their school. And, you have to explain to a child why you're doing that, and they understood. I had that discussion with them about terrorism. And it was, it wasn't the first time I was discussing things like that, because being in the U.S. when my children were in public school, my son was in public school, I did talk about, school shootings and what to do in those, if there was an active shooter. So we started having those conversations again in this different context of terrorism. How
has that climate affected them in these 3 years?
I like to think that they know what's going on in the world, but that they also have retained their empathy. And I think that's a really important thing for us to do, and it's a difficult thing for us to do, because when you're frightened, people tend to try to find somebody to lash out at, somebody to if they keep away from a certain type of person, they'll be safe. And certainly one of the things I realize is that there is no safe place in this world right now, and I think, the important thing is not to run away from situations, but to face them and to try to keep our humanity.
That being the case, does Nowhere Boy, I don't want to say does Nowhere Boy lead to a happy ending? Is there such a thing as a happy ending?
Well, I think with children's books you need to have hope, and that is important, and I think that's a really big part of what makes America special, is that we do have this, almost a brand of hope in our national spirit, that we believe that we can, our lives can change for the better. And I think that's a really important ingredient of a children's book, too. So I would say that the book ends on a very hopeful note.
It does. It does. What has been the reaction? What have you been hearing about the book since folks have had a chance to read it?
I've had a wonderful reaction. I just got back from a 10-day tour around the country, and I spoke to, I think, nearly 2,000 kids at schools across this country. And, there's a real hunger amongst both the children and the educators for books that really get kids thinking about, their place in the world and thinking about how to treat people who are different than them and how to listen. And I think that's a really important message of my book, is I feel like we're in a moment in time here where we don't want to listen to people who have different opinions, and we jump to judgment right away. And I feel like it's very important to keep, our ears open.
Nowhere Boy is the name of the book. Katherine March has joined us here this morning on Indiana in the Morning. Katherine, congratulations on this book. This seems to me, it just seems to me to be a big achievement in furthering a dialogue that needs to take place.
I hope so. I hope so. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. We appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.